Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today I'll be showing you the new optic added in 12.12.30, the Swampfox Trihawk. I haven't seen many people talking about this, and when I used it on stream and in a recent video, a ton of people didn't even know that it existed, but I've really been enjoying it in the short time that it's been accessible to me so far. First and foremost, the Trihawk is unlocked at Skier 3, but appears to not have been added to the loot table at all. Unless it's just rare, I have literally never seen one on the flea market whatsoever, and so I had to wait until Skier 3 to try it out. Once you have it though, at 34k, this puts it on a lower to middle position cost-wise, and it fits directly to regular Picatinny rails like the more familiar optics such as the Elcan. I will admit I was slightly disappointed to find out that the 3x is actually a 3.5x, not a massive problem, but I personally feel that we don't have enough choice in the 2 to 3 region, but as you can see in game it's mislabeled in the name. So, practically speaking, what got me onto this in the first place was using it with the AK-101 as a quick test. I noticed that compared to some of the other budget optics in this price range, you can quite comfortably full auto the Trihawk without losing sight picture even with a fairly ordinary AK. Normally this is the realm of pricey scopes like the Voodoo and the Razor. The reticle on the Trihawk is really clean compared to something like the TAC-30, leaving you with good visibility when aiming over targets, and when you strafe and lean you keep a fairly clear sight picture. For this video I'm using a 49 recoil AK-101, which is nothing special. Let's compare it to a few of the alternatives to get an idea of how it stacks up. The cheapest equivalent optic in my opinion is the Prism 2.5x. This costs 20k from Skier 2, so is really quite an efficient scope on price, but the reticle is a bit weird and can be distracting, which is why it's not that favoured across the player base. For the price though, I've always quite liked this one personally. The Prism does appear larger on screen than the Trihawk, with about the same vignetting, i.e. the black effect that you see around the sides. For the record, I play at 64 FOV, so it might be slightly different if you have higher or lower view settings. Most players do seem to play around 60ish these days, because whilst max FOV has peripheral vision advantages, the disadvantages from increased camera recoil and smaller targets can make it not worth using. Interestingly, although the Prism is 2.5x, because it's bigger on screen, it actually looks about the same zoom broadly. On full auto, it does pull the reticle out of the sight picture just a little bit, which makes it slightly awkward to use, and when leaning, the Prism pulls more black into the scope than the Trihawk does. With the changes to lean inertia, I believe this effect is better across the board, and especially with the budget scopes, as previously players could lean so fast that it was really noticeable, but with the decrease in lean speed, it's less badly affecting the scopes that are more prone to it, at least that's how it feels to me anyway. If you like the Prism, you'll probably enjoy the Trihawk too, and with a much cleaner reticle, I think more people will enjoy this one than the Prism if that's their major issue. The other scope that I usually really enjoy is the TAC-30. This is 33k from Jaeger 2 after completing his level 20 quest, the Hermit, which is a very easy lighthouse one. For this price, getting a decent scope with 1x and 4x variable is awesome, but one of the biggest issues with the TAC is the vignetting when going into full auto, as you lose sight picture on the first few shots quite badly. Otherwise, it's great, but some people find the reticle too chunky as well, which I can understand. As the TAC is also quite large on screen, you really feel the 4x zoom, so although the variable is nice, a scope in the middle like the Trihawk can be great for certain maps and loadouts. The Monstrum at 39k at Jaeger 2 is super clean, but because the scope is small on screen, you don't get that much zoom. It full autos relatively well and only has a small amount of vignetting when you lean too. It's very much a personal preference on this guy. Some love it, but for me, I'd usually just take a holo instead, certainly in part due to the picture-in-picture FPS drops, which is an unfortunate but unavoidable aspect of scopes in Tarkov. Again, if you like the Monstrum, you'll probably like the Swampfox as well, with a bit more zoom and a good reticle. Next, I wanted to re-look at the Elcan, which is a bit more expensive at 40k average on the flea, because I used to use this scope all the time, but I swapped out to the TAC-30 for the most part. When I tried it again, I was pleasantly surprised by the lack of losing sight picture on both the 1x and the 4, and the vignetting is not amazing, but it's manageable. Although it's a little bit more expensive, given you get the variability of zoom, I think it's a pretty close call between this and the Trihawk. The HAMR scope was one that really surprised me, as another scope with about 40k average price on the flea, I always thought of this one as one of the better optics, but pulling it into the range, it loses some sight picture on full auto, and the vignetting on lean is actually really bad. The Bravo on the other hand, which again is another 40k fleet average, didn't lose sight picture on full auto and had much lower leaning issues too. This is a scope that has been plagued with bugs in the past when you use the mount on top, which technically makes it more expensive, as if you want a 1x you need to mount something else, but historically there was something wrong with the recoil when you used one. I tried it with the Burris and honestly it looked okay, and with the reticle being relatively large for one of these types of optic, it might be worth giving a second go. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I've not used it for a long time and I've not seen anyone else use it either, so perhaps it's just been unfairly branded as being bad or bugged or something like that. My only issue with these two is that the extra expense of the optic on top and the apparent magnification from the 4x means that whilst it's good at range, the Trihawk has that kind of middle ground of zoom that gives you a little bit more flexibility on certain maps when it comes to taking close range fights where you don't want to use the red dot but a 4x is too much. In this category, the last one that I looked at was the Valday, as again this is another 40k average price scope. As it's our only cheap 1x6 variable, on 1x mode it looked very much like the others that were in the good enough to use camp, not losing sight picture on full auto, which is cool. The vignetting is really borderline to the point of nearly making it properly bad, but I still think it's probably usable if you want to have the range. While not really comparable to the new scope because it has a very different zoom profile, I still thought it was interesting to take a look at. A few random others that I tried with the 3.5 and 4x ACOGs, which both lose sight picture on full auto, and although they look okay normally, they have pretty bad vignetting when strafing and leaning. The 3x on the EOTech HHS is really bad, it's small on screen, it loses sight picture and is one of the worst on leaning as well. For all of these, I'd rather have the Trihawk. So far, we've seen how the new optic stacks up against the cheaper options, but there are a few other high-powered 1x something variables that I think are worth looking at just in terms of why people like using them so much. The first one is not that expensive actually, which is the Schmidt & Bender 2 1x8 variable. This is a really nice optic, great reticle, keeps loads of sight picture on full auto on the 1x, and clearly gives you a ton of reach with the 8, so why is it 30k on the fleet? This scope has one big problem, which is that the 1x mode sensitivity is really bad. It's only about double that of the 8x, which is really sluggish and is hard to aim because it will feel slow to everyone based on other similar optics. Also, maybe the 8x is just a bit too much for Tarkov, except on Lighthouse, but I really believe that if the 1x sensitivity was fixed, this would be a lot more expensive because right now it's just super awkward to use. Then we have the Voodoo and the Razor. These average about 75 to 80k on the fleet, and from what we have seen on the other scopes, they are clearly better than the rest. They have almost no vignetting at all around the edge, nice large optics to see well, and on full auto they don't really come close to losing sight picture at all. There's a reason that they are both expensive, and you see them being used often by high-level players as it's hard to match the quality of these two. You could argue that the Razor reticle is slightly nicer to use, but again it's a personal choice. One amazing thing about the Voodoo is if you complete Outcast from Jaeger, you can buy it for 46k from him. With 3 per reset, it's an amazing scope for that price. So how does the Trihawk then stack up amongst our optical choices in 12-12-30? I think the biggest downside of this scope is not having a variable optic, but the zoom level isn't that extreme, so you can get away with using it plus a laser or flashlight for point fire in my opinion, because you can engage targets much closer up than you can with a regular 4 from another scope. So much of optics in Tarkov is highly subjective because things like the reticle itself and the range that players feel confident to use their scopes over can vary so widely. This is in part related to weapon ergonomics and ADS speed too, but some of the issues that people will have with the other cheap scopes like the reticles and the vignetting are very minimal on the Trihawk, so I think it's at least worth a try at 35k. Who knows, you might love it. It feels super clean to me, so maybe give it a go once you get to Skier 3 and let me know how it feels for you. If you enjoyed this video and you're confused about the zeroing system in Tarkov, go and watch this video next because it is sorta lying to you. Otherwise, as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, hit all the buttons if you enjoyed the video, and as always, have fun in your raids.